So I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Diak Feather Weaver, mundanely known as Carla Tillman. I have a bunch of different backgrounds, one of them being a paramedic. So normally I tell my students in face-to-face classes, if you have a heart attack, I've got you covered. That will be a little more difficult here, but I will call 911. Um, so I have a degree in art history, and I also have a degree in textiles, hence the combination of things here. What I wanted to cover, because images are so powerful for those of us who are interested in garb or textiles or clothing or the history of clothing, any of that, how we deal with images in terms of starting to identify what we can believe, what we cannot believe, because paintings often lie. Um, but they can also be a rich source of information if we kind of know what to look for. And I'm suspecting that a lot of you already know this, but I'm going to go into some really specific details with some specific examples that will help you interpret mostly Northern stuff, but I'm going to sneak into Italy for a little bit because, you can't help it. So speaking of which, this is one of my favorite paintings. It's by Titian. It's Isabella d'Este, who was a tremendous patroness of the arts. Um, the textiles and garments in this are magnificent. I know people who have tried to reconstruct that hat or have looked at the fur that she's wearing or the embroidery on her underneath garments, her chemise. There's only one kicker with this painting. It's all fantasy. She was 60 years old when this painting was made. So this is her remembering garments that she wore when she was much younger, and she described them. And we know some of this from the contracts that still exist between Titian and some of his clients. So this is how she wanted to be seen as this young 20-something woman. But none of the garments that are portrayed in this painting either actually existed or existed at the time that it was painted. So this is my prime example of paintings lie. So now we're going to go back up north again and actually look at some things. I adore this painting. I've written about it several times. It is not large. I like to show the scale image of it here because it is so rich in detail. I think it's really useful to see the size of this painting. It's not large. It's in the National Gallery in London. You can go see it. I am going to go through some of the detail of the painting, detail that are in the painting, to show you that there is a lot of there are a lot of contemporary objects in this painting, contemporary to the time in which Jan van Eyck was painting this in 1434. So I'm going to kind of walk through the details of truth and fiction in this painting. For instance, in the background on the wall behind the couple, there is this mirror. And if you look closely at the mirror, it's actually reflecting two people who are clearly standing in front of the couple that we don't see except in this mirror. And there's a inscription underneath, which for this time period is fairly unusual. It kind of riffs on something that was more common. Um, it says Johannes van Eyck Futek. Normally, the inscription would be Jan van Eyck made this, or Jan van Eyck made me, referring to the painting being made by a particular artist. In this case, it says Jan van Eyck was here. So it's implying, as does the mirror, that Jan van Eyck was actually present and a witness to this betrothal ceremony between Arnolfini and his bride-to-be, Chinami, both of whom come from powerful textile families. She is Italian, he is Flemish, and it is this melding of these two empires. and businesses in addition to the couple being married that is being witnessed here. So we both have the artist who's acting as a witness, and we have the artist who is documenting through painting the event itself. There are other details that we can identify as being contemporary to Jan van Eyck and Arnolfini and Shinami's time period. For instance, the chandelier here is this magnificent cast and cut and etched chandelier, but there's also symbolism in it. Instead of there being multiple candles that are lit, there is only one, and that is symbolizing the idea that these two families are coming together to be one union, and they're becoming a family, and they're becoming a combined business. Another detail that I love in the center here, can you guys see my little cursor moving at all?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so in the center thing here, this is the back of the bedpost. And if I go back a couple of things, it's right back here in the main painting. So we've looked at the mirror and the chandelier, and then this bedpost here has to do with the position of these two figures. He is standing next to the window, which indicates that his job in their union is to go out into the world and do business stuff. Her position is next to their marital bed, indicating that her job is to remain within the domestic sphere, and one of her big jobs is to produce an heir. The way that she is holding her dress here reinforces that idea. She is not pregnant. This was a fashionable way that we see in a number of paintings, and there are some descriptions of this, that at the point where the cult of Mary, the Virgin Mary, becomes really popular, first in the middle 14th century and all through the 15th century, she's she's kind of making a reference to Mary being pregnant. So while she is not pregnant, there's this reference. We do know, unfortunately, that the couple did not actually have any children. But there is this hope. And so this image here is of this nice domestic broom and an image of Saint Margaret coming out of a dragon, which is a symbol for the pain, the difficulty, everything having to do with childbirth. And Saint Margaret was the patron saint of women in childbirth. So there's this reinforcement of the idea of what the roles are of these two people. Looks like a really, really gorgeous carved head, but it's packed with this kind of symbolism. Underneath the bed, there is this Anatolian carpet. We have physical examples of carpets that look very much like this. Again, we know that both of these families were involved in the textile trade, which wasn't just the local trade, it was the international trade in textiles. So it's unsurprising that there is this reference here to this carpet. We also have details like we can see both of their shoes, or except they're not shoes, they're actually pattens. So the pattens are what you wear underneath your shoes. His, again, are on the side of him going outside, and these are wooden pattens that you would wear underneath your shoes so that when you're walking through the mud and the horse and cow and pig and goat and chicken and dog and cat poo, you're not getting that on your actual shoes. And you take these off when you come into the sphere. Taking them off also symbolizes that this is a formal ceremony. You don't leave your poo-covered pattens on, you take them off. We also have the image of hers in the background. These are clearly ones that are not necessarily made for outside. They're for her to walk around the house in, or maybe go down to the cellar, or maybe go out to some of the outbuildings to oversee things. Her job is not to do tasks, but to oversee them. But we also have her taking off her patents, but clearly they're a different kind of patent that one wears inside the house. And of course, finally, there's the dog that hangs out between the two of them and, among other things, symbolizes fidelity. So these two are supposed to be faithful to each other. So here are his patents, here are her patents right back there. And here is this faithful little dog. So then we come to her, and this gorgeous green fur lined this is a wool gown with this cut ruching on it, high-waisted belt. The blue underdress is kind of a nice touch because it also connects to the Virgin Mary, who is almost always pictured of wearing blue. There's a really beautiful little bit of brocaded tablet woven band at her wrist here. And then there's this pretty iconic headdress. And here I've got a couple of details of it where we can see that this is layers and layers and layers of linen that has this lovely ruffled edge on it. No, it is not goffered. And here's a closer detail of it. So there are all these details that are very much connected to the idea of life that would have been lived by Arnolfini and Shinami, so contemporary with them. It is really tempting then to look at this whole portrait as simply a snapshot, a photograph of life for this wealthy couple in 1434. But there's a problem. This veil is actually not contemporary. The veil was worn more commonly in 1375 than it would have been worn in 1434. So why is she wearing this outdated piece of headgear when she's wearing a dress that is very much contemporary with that 1434 moment? And again, it has a lot to do with symbolism. Um, the veil being, it was not uncommon for classes to wear older garments if you were an older member of that class. It shows dignity. It shows a sense of continuity, of history, of seriousness. Maybe this was an heirloom. Um, the construction and the amount of really fine linen with this ruffled edge. This is a long piece. When I did a reconstruction of it, it is 7 to 9 yards long. And while you can weave this on a normal horizontal loom, you have to do some additional things to make the ruffles happen. So this was a specialty piece of weaving. But we also have images that show us that this veil is connected to the idea of older women. And this historicizes the headdress. So this wouldn't have been the headdress that Shinami would have worn day to day. Maybe she was wearing this for the betrothal, and Van Eyck really is recording that. But it is also possible that Van Eyck put her in this headdress to reinforce the messages that are in the painting of the seriousness of the occasion that's being witnessed by putting her in this older style of headdress. It gives the sense of weight and history to the image. So here's an image of Virgin Mary's mum wearing the headdress in a portrait that is by Robert Campin. Here's another image of Elizabeth and the Virgin Mary, where Elizabeth is wearing a ruffled edge headdress. So there are these other images of religious women, but religious older women who are shown in this headdress contemporary to the time that Van Eyck is painting. So he's using this headdress in a really particular way. So can we believe it or not? It's a little hard to tell. We do find the same headdress shown in sculptures. So this is Anna and Joachim, who are the Virgin Mary's parents. And this is their betrothal. And you see that Anna here is wearing the same kind of ruffled edge headdress. And here is Anna again with the Virgin Mary and the birth of Christ. So again, this headdress shows up on a lot of historicized figures. Are there any questions right here? Okay, and thanks. I got to get a drink in there. So I want to show another way in which garments were used to indicate the passage of time, were used to identify different figures, even though the viewers could recognize which were contemporary garments and which weren't. We may have lost some of that now, but the viewers who were looking at these things could read what the garments were being used
Oh, the
for.
microwave?
I'm sorry?
I think someone accidentally unmuted themselves.
Okay. Um, so this is another painting by Jan van Eyck and his brother Hubert that was done in 1432, just a little bit before the Arnolfini portrait. It's called the Ghent altarpiece. It does now again reside in Ghent. It left Ghent for a while during World War II when it was stolen by the Nazis and hidden away in a salt mine in Austria. The panels at various points were taken apart, but they are now all reunited together in Ghent. This is the altarpiece open. I don't have a view of it closed because I'm not focusing on that, but this is all the panels open. This lower central panel shows the sacrifice of the Lamb of God. And then, of course, we have Christ in heaven here with his mom, the Virgin Mary, next to him, and John the Baptist, who is often pictured in a hair shirt. Obviously, Adam and Eve on either side. We have choirs of angels, literally choirs of angels. Here they are singing. We have the lamb on the altar in this lower area. Off to the side, we have both witnesses. We have, we have monks here. We have important figures. These two groups are, in this case, religious figures, past popes, saints, male saints. And over on this side, we have the women saints. And it's the women saints that I want to look at. So here they are a little bit closer up. What's interesting about these saints, and again, this is why we have to understand something about the painting to understand what we're seeing happen with the garments. If you know anything about garments from that 1432 moment, you can recognize that most of these garments are either completely ahistorical, meaning that they're kind of so amorphous that they don't have a particular time period, or you'll recognize that there are a couple of different time periods represented in these garments. So there's a span of about 200 to 300 years represented with a lot of these garments. Does anyone have a sense of why Van Eyck would paint these female saints this way? Sorry, you can't take the teacher out of the teacher. The reason is because not all these saints come from the same time period. And he's using older garments to represent saints who came earlier in the canon. So there's saints here from, say, the 300s, and there are also saints here from the 700s and the 1000s. And distinguishing them historically was done by putting them in garments from different time periods. So, for instance, you have Barbara here with her little iconic tower. And she is in kind of an amorphous garment, but the sideless surcoat is not contemporary with 1432. And so it's indicating that this saint is a much older saint. This happens to be Catherine. So there are ways in which these garments are used to indicate meaning or iconography or the passage of time or to help identify specific figures. There are other textiles that show up in Northern Renaissance paintings, and one is a painting by Dirk Boutz the Elder of the Virgin and the Child. Here is Mary in her iconic blue amorphous, timeless gown and the red cloak. These are very standard representations of Mary in the 14th and 15th century. She's in this lovely contemporary Flemish landscape for the most part. You can see a little church spire in the background. Um, the height of the skyline is very contemporary with um, prints and all sorts of other images of being in Flanders. So it's a more or less contemporary scene in the background there. It puts her in nature. There's little walls, shows that she's a little bit walled off from a contemporary setting. It puts her in her garden. It connects Mary to the idea that she exists in a way that is fairly timeless. She exists both in contemporary Flanders, but she is this timeless presence. And again, this was very much during the time period where the cult of Mary, interest in Mary as an intercessor between humans and Christ. It's like, go talk to your mom because you know, dad might be a little angry, but talk to mom. So Mary takes on this role of intercessor, and she becomes a very popular subject for these kinds of paintings. Behind her is what's called a cloth of honor. So again, it frames her, it separates her a little bit from the contemporary landscape, giving her this additional timeless quality. The textile looks like a gorgeous silk velvet cut and voided and brocaded with metal thread here in the background and velvet pile, silk pile in the foreground here. It looks like a lovely and more or less contemporary textile. But again, there are some things about it that tell us that this is not a representation of an actual piece of cloth. For one thing, the motif is too big. We know this from extant, not only examples of cloth, but descriptions of cloths that were woven in Lucca, in Venice, in Vienna, in Siena, in Lyon, France, all over the place where we know that the patterns were not quite this big. We still have records of the way in which the draw looms created these patterns, even though there are no medieval extant draw looms that survive. So we know that the pattern is a little bit big. We also know things about Bouts the Elder from some contracts that still exist, from contemporary writings about his painting practice. And we know, for instance, that he was a painter who did talk to makers of textiles. So the way in which this textile looks comes from his knowledge of actual contemporary pieces of cut and voided velvets or brocaded velvets. He was aware of what those really looked like, and he is mimicking that. He's just making the pattern larger. Um, and again, this comes from some of the contracts. There are other painters where we also see what look like velvets or pattern textiles, but we know that there were patterns that were used across media. What I mean by that is that there's a pattern that might show up in textiles, in metalwork, in ceramics. There was this overlaying of patterns that would show up in different materials. A painter who is known, not the master of Flamel, but the master of the Ursula altarpiece, we know that he worked with people who were in the metal industry who were creating templates for metal etching. And then he interpreted that into textiles in his paintings. So again, if you look at the textiles that are in his paintings, they look beautifully, like beautifully painted textiles. But he was not in that case looking at textiles. He was interpreting templates that were used for metal etching, and he just interpreted them to represent textiles. So by looking at those contracts and kind of reading the context in which he was working, we understand more about how he was choosing to represent textiles. So we are going to dip down south now and look at Simone Martini's work, in part because unlike the Van Eyck and the Dirk Boutz paintings, where we have some questions about what exactly is being represented or how they're doing it. A lot of the pieces painted by Simone Martini, scholars have been able to identify the exact textiles or very similar textiles, both in terms of scale and material, and knowing a lot about who commissioned the works. This is an Annunciation scene on the side. So this is the angel Gabriel who is telling Mary that she's pregnant. She looks surprised. I would too. Here we have Saint Margaret and Saint Assanis represented here. It's hard just, I think, from this image to see, but there is a very distinct pattern that Gabriel is wearing. And here's a detail of it. So you can see there's a lot of sheen in the gold bits here. So this implies that there is gold metal in with the thread. There's this lovely plaid. What I want to show you is, and this is one of the things that we know about this painting, is that it was commissioned again by a family who were enormous in the textile trade. And we know that there were silks that were being imported from Asia through Cairo up into Italy. And this is an example of one of them. So the scale is right. The materials are right. The time period is right. The trade routes and the people who are engaged in that trade is right. It is much easier for us to say that the angel here is painted in what would have been really truly a contemporary textile that Martini would have seen. We can't know positively 100%, but we can make a really good case for it. Another example is this, sorry about the typo, altar of Saint Louis de Toulouse. So if you look here on his knees, the outside of the cloak here, you can see little spots. We can see a carpet underneath. We can see textiles here. We can see a double-sided textile here, so we can kind of see this little plaid, wool plaid on one side of it and a pattern on the other side. We can also identify them. And again, this is a Simone Martini painting. So the Sienese wool, the Tartar silk, velvet from Tabriz, an Anatolian carpet. There are extant examples of every single one of these textiles that still exist, such as this, which is a red velvet from Iran, probably Tabriz. And these things are identified separately. It's not like someone, I mean, there are people who've paired these things up now, but they've been identified separately. And they're examples of exactly this style of carpet that still exist. There are writings about the Sienese wool that were made in this red and black checked pattern because it was a very classical Sienese wool. These Tartar silks, there are records, not only records of them being imported, but these silks, we still have examples of them. So Martini is a painter who we want to give a lot of veracity to the textiles that are represented in his work because we really can identify not only through the contracts, not only through the patrons of these paintings, but through the extant textiles that we still have that makes sense for him to have been able to see, that we want to give a lot of veracity to the textiles that are represented in his work. And what's interesting is that his style of painting was not as um, massively accurately detailed as the Northern Renaissance artists like Van Eyck do, where you've got the dog that has these individual little tiny hairs on it, and those patents that have, a little bit of smudgy dirt or something on the bottom of them. So Martini's style of painting didn't have that same level of intense veracity, but the textiles are. So again, it's really important to understand the context around images. I have to say, if I were just to see this painting on its own, I would go, okay, those are interesting textiles, but I don't think that I would give them as much weight as being, oh no, those really are accurate representations of the textiles, both in terms of material and scale. And then the very last slide that I want to show you all before we can throw it open to questions and discussion and conversation and your all's experience, um, is that we tend in books, because that's how we have access to a lot of these images, to think of them as being very flat. This painting is not. It's actually remarkably three-dimensional. It's subtle in some cases, but there are layers to it that show up. And again, there are a number of artists who are doing this both in north and south of Europe, who are creating these paintings that have tremendous texture to them. And some of that texture is for purely visual effect. But in some cases, we're able to identify that the texture that's being portrayed really is trying to not just get at the idea of a textile, but to represent an actual extant textile. So that is the last image that I have, and I'm going to stop sharing and see if there are any thoughts that people have.
That was a brilliant class. Thank you so much.
So how do you all choose the textiles that you choose to make your garb out of? Where do you get ideas from?
I'll go first because no one else seems to be talking. I actually do also look at paintings because I do a lot of Roman. For example, there are lots of really good Roman wall paintings that depict people, and there are similar questions about how accurate is the information that we're getting when we look at paintings that are contemporaneous with the time period we're studying. So it's a question that doesn't have easy answers, and there's a lot of debate about it. And we're certainly not left with a lot of, remaining textiles from that time period because it was 2000 years ago. So there isn't a lot to physically examine all the time. But yeah, there are similar questions.
I was sort of on the opposite end of the time spectrum from Bracha. I do Isabella in Spain. So we're lucky enough to have an enormous number of wardrobe inventories to really lean on. So we can at least see, written records of what the upper classes used and collected and left behind.
Yes, so same for Eastern Europe. Like things like wills would list a lot of garments. The upper class wills would list both garments and fabrics. But of course, they don't have really detailed descriptions of them.
Now, I'm doing a time period, I'm doing 8th to 10th century Persia, and there's not a whole lot of painting that survives. So I'm using a lot of translated written texts and then trying to match it to the closest extant garment I can find.
How do you do that? I mean, what steps do you go through to be able to do that?
In terms of matching the text with the extant garments or finding the texts or what?
Matching, doing the matching.
I tend to work kind of in concentric circles. One is geography and one is time.
Mhm.
So I have a text exactly from my time and place describing what people were wearing at court, making fun of somebody who wore the wrong thing to the wrong occasion. And then if I don't have, we have some painting on pottery, but it's very small. There's not a lot of detail. Maybe that could be the thing, but it could also be 100 other things. But I have an extant and it's from the century before or the century later, but it's from a group of people that I knew had contact during my century. Okay, so the trade routes were there. We had immigrants coming in. We had artisans who were relocated during a battle. So I try and find the connecting thread that would say, well, the thing that survives is 50 years too late, 75 years too late. I try not to go past the century, but I try and find a connecting thread saying, hey, these cultures were already in contact during the right time frame. So that influence could have been there and the description fits. Or the other direction I go is geographically. The extant is from the right time, but it's from, 3 cities over or a country over. Okay, can I connect those two peoples?
So
Through trade.
how do you deal with the textile terms? Because one of the things that I'm figuring out, of course, in just trying to research the draw loom is that draw loom is a contemporary term, and there are lots of historians who use that term, but there's no those words don't exist to describe a particular loom if I'm reading something from 15th century
Yeah.
France. Terms
Yeah,
like
no.
rate loom or so yeah, how do you marry that terminology?
So my clothing for Abbasid Persia class has a section that is 400 terms for a rectangle of fabric. Because I have 100 different names at least, and they are all just described as rectangles of fabric. I couldn't tell you how they were worn. And sometimes things get named based on who wore them. So the ruler's favorite courtesan showed up at a court party and wore this garment in a new way. So that style of wearing it is now called the name of that garment and her name. And it's like, I have no idea what that was. It involves this garment, but I don't know what she did with it.
Yeah.
So I do a little bit of playing with my search terms. What do the modern scholars all agree to call this thing? Versus what did one particular culture call it? Versus what did the other culture I was able to tie the extant versus the description to? What did that culture call it? So I play with search terms and try and find similar descriptions in different places or different times. But yeah, it's frustrating. It's a very much a word association game.
Right.
But I also run into the Sasanian Empire stuff we're looking at has a lot of really detailed representations of royal themes, so hunting or feasting or battle. But I don't have a lot of extants to work with, so I don't know if what I'm seeing is a representation that means this was the king, or if that was a style of garment that everybody actually wore, particularly when it comes to the pants with either ruffles or fringes on them.
Mm-hmm.
They're in almost every engraved plate of fancy guy going hunting. And I don't know if that's actually a style or if that was just meant to show I can afford enough cloth to do extra decorative things with.
So what do the rest of you do?
Can I build on something Vashti was just saying?
Yes, please.
Um, she mentioned that descriptions of clothing from the neighboring places can be really helpful because the culture itself will probably, there's going to be a lot of things taken as everybody knows, everybody already in on the thing. So you don't have to go into a lot of details, but where cultures say travel like travel writing or somebody writing about this invading tribe and it's wearing this and this and this, they tend to go into a lot more detail. And I also compare whatever illuminations from my time period or physical objects, say like from early period Ukrainian, you would see illuminations tend to be very tiny, and the objects where people are portrayed are like, say, like something again small, like on piece of jewelry, on a brooch or something. There's a dancing woman celebrating Rusalki, um, and you know that because she instead of her sleeves all nice and rolled up, as we know from written records, that the sleeves need to be confined and at your cuffs for both modesty and protection from the demons. And the only time that people would let their sleeves loose, it would be during that specific celebration. So, it's either a depiction of the actual Rusalki demon or of the mermaid demon, or a woman celebrating Rusalia, which is the um, the summer festival. Uh, but it's very tiny, so you take those things and then you compare them with grave finds and archaeological finds and try to put it all together that way.
Yeah, it's tricky. You have to use those multiple sources to really be able to figure a lot of stuff out.
Yes, I remember somebody at class at Penzic referred to us as a society of grave robbers, that we all wear our best because so much of the so much of what we are able to find are the very the most beautiful, the most prized possessions, because that's what people were buried with and that's what people were painted in. So we don't see as much of what people wore every day.
So I'm typing back in again, sorry. As you also know, I'm doing Bronze Age stuff, not just classical era stuff. And it's even harder to get documentation. And we're lucky that we have wall paintings, but wall paintings, just like other frescoes, like they only can tell you so much, and you don't know how much of it is messaging rather than photographs. And it is a risky proposition to treat paintings like they're photographs, because they're not, and photographs can also be staged, but I think you get where I'm going with that. But what we do have sometimes is remains from Egypt, specifically because the climate allowed for certain preservation of literally 3,500-year-old pieces of clothing. And from that, we can extrapolate, oh, this is how this was constructed, and this is how it's different from the wall painting. What does that tell us about the other cultures that they may have had contact with? We can see the stitching here, so we know that they had the technology to do this kind of stitching. So you can get a lot from physical remains. It's just that you don't always have them, especially when they're 3, 4, 5,000 years old. So it's the same problem, but worse. Also, I'm going to stop recording now if that's all right with everyone.
Cool.